You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
This episode of the Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And welcome back to another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show along at DolphinsTalk.com, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Going to start off the show today with a couple of housekeeping notes. Unfortunately, didn't get to watch the preseason finale against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so no show on that game due to a scheduling conflict with Evan. He and I are going to record a joint episode likely this Thursday, which will air Friday, previewing our Week 1 season opener against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I will also be appearing on Finside the NFL on Wednesday evening. Believe that'll kick off at 7 or 8 Eastern time, but I will be on the panel with Reason, Richmond Webb, and several other Dolphins content creators, so make sure you check that out on the Finside the NFL YouTube channel. Now, this week's show, we were going to plan this out, Evan and I, but Evan is currently indisposed, moving to Washington State. I'll let him give you the details on as to why when he is back on the next episode. But anyway, we were going to do a show detailing the final 53-man roster, as a lot of transactions took place over the last week. So I was going to do a quick show solo effort tonight, just kind of flying through that, no pun intended, Evan, to talk about my thoughts on the roster, and then we'll actually preview the Jaguars game in earnest in that episode coming up later this week. But before we get into that, we have a whiskey segment update. I think I've done this one already, but just sipping on a nice, easy drinking bourbon, which is High West, or it's not bourbon, it's American whiskey, High West Campfire. American whiskey made in, I believe it's Park City, Utah, but this one has a blend of bourbon, rye, and scotch in it. Nice, easy sipper, pretty good taste. Finish is a little bit long lasting, but I'd give it like somewhere between like a 3.75 and a 3.8. Pretty nice quality. Still want to try their Midwinter's Nights Dram. I've heard that's very good. But again, that's High West Distillery in Park City, Utah. So, on to the Miami Dolphins roster. The full 53-man roster is now updated after the initial wave of cuts and then several transactions, including sort of a parking lot deal with the Dolphins and long snapper Blake Ferguson. I know a lot of people got caught unawares, but you have to understand there's certain roster machinations that teams can do to get guys back on the roster or get them back at a less dollar amount, by cutting a vested veteran and then re-signing them after week 1. Stuff like that. And Blake Ferguson's thing was like that. He is back with the team as the long snapper. Full practice squad is now available as well. Just kind of wanted to give my brief thoughts on each of those rooms as we go through, and then maybe we'll do the unit I think is the strongest and weakest on both sides of the ball to finish it off. So we'll start with the quarterbacks this time. We'll go offense into defense instead of defense to offense as we did on the last show. I think in the middle of the preseason after the Commanders game. So quarterbacks, Miami kept 2. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa got the massive contract. He's on the roster. And then Skylar Thompson won the backup job. Now, if you've listened to my show this offseason, you kind of know that Skylar Thompson had sort of moved ahead of Mike White dating all the way back to OTAs and minicamp. Got opportunities to play with, some of the 2s and 3s or guys that are, on the active roster and some on the practice squad now in the preseason more so than Mike White. And I think he clearly outplayed Mike White. And you got to see Mike White play against some starters and some of the 2s and 3s from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If you've watched that game, I watched a couple highlights of it, didn't watch the game live myself. But clearly Mike White struggled in that game. I think he's always been pretty overrated, especially by the Jets fans, just because he had one good game against the Cincinnati Bengals in relief duty, a couple years ago. With Skyler, I think I talked about this on the last show. I think fans' concerns are overblown because Mike McDaniel tailors this offense so much to the quarterback, whether it's Tua or Skyler. If there's ever a time that Skyler has to be the quarterback of the Dolphins, whether it's a starting gig in a game if Tua's out, or if he has to come in relief of Tua mid-game, you will definitely see a change in play call. There's certain things that Tua is great at that Skyler isn't, and there's certain things that Skyler's a little bit better at than Tua, including throwing on the run, kind of moving around in the pocket and getting things open. Processing is not one of them. I think that's the biggest difference. Is Tua is, high-speed internet, and Skylar Thompson's still kind of an AOL dial-up in terms of some of the stuff you see. But you also didn't really get a clear picture of that in the preseason because they're calling more vanilla looks to get guys in one-on-one reps to isolate them, sort of like a college all-star game atmosphere. Very rarely in the preseason did you see any kind of like run action, play action, or RPO stuff given to Skyler or Mike White. A couple rollouts here and there, but that was about it. You see that action kind of come into play on almost every dropback you see from Tua when he's the quarterback on the field. So a little bit disingenuous to kind of make those comparisons like for like. I would stand by this in terms of most teams. If your starting quarterback's missing more than, say, 3 games, your season's probably not going to have the outcome that you want, unless it's like 3 games at the beginning or 1 or 2 of those games because you've already locked up home field and you're just resting him for the playoffs. If it gets to the point where Skyler has to play like 3 or more games, the season's probably already taken a couple of wrong turns. So obviously, Tua the starter day one, Skylar Thompson the backup. They did add former New York Jet Tim Boyle, who's played for a host of other teams, including Detroit, to the practice squad. I don't really get that move right there. But, at this point, who am I anyway, who are all of us to kind of consider Mike McDaniel's decisions at the quarterback position poor? He's gotten mileage out of Skylar Thompson. He's got mileage out of Teddy Bridgewater when they've had to play. Mike White came in a couple games last year and threw some touchdown passes. Like, if that's who they want, that's who they want. If they're going to try and develop someone younger, I'd imagine that they'll make a corresponding move later in the season. But I just don't know realistically what you would want to do, especially now that the rule change that we thought was in effect, where you could elevate your practice squad quarterback as many times as you needed to, was actually not ratified by the NFLPA. So you cannot do that. So your practice squad quarterback can only be called up 3 times. So in this instance, they're using Tim Boyle as someone who knows the system, who's played in live games. He was the starter for the Jets against the Dolphins last year on the Black Friday game. This is what they're doing, just to have someone in the pipeline who can come in and be, a backup if necessary to Skylar Thompson. Running back room, honestly kind of surprised that they didn't keep Chris Brooks. I thought they would keep all 5, based on how I thought, McDaniel would certainly kind of maneuver the roster based on what he did last year. You were simply subbing out Savon Ahmed, who was cut early in camp, and adding in Jaylen Wright. So the 4 that they kept, true running backs, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, Jaylen Wright, Jeff Wilson Jr., I think you can see roles for all 4 of those guys. Maybe not everybody's active on game day. There were situations last year where Jeff Wilson Jr., was not active on game days until later in the season when injuries started to occur. But you can kind of see, like, you sort of have Mostert and Achane are your 1-2. Jaylen Wright can probably come in and fulfill either of those guys' roles. And then Jeff Wilson, was more of a power back last year, has lost some weight, slimmed down. So I think he's kind of trying to be sort of that fourth guy who can do all the same stuff. Now, I do think you'll see Devon Achane get plenty of reps as a slot guy and even split out wide, as we saw in the preseason. Skylar Thompson gave him a really nice throw in the Tampa Bay game in the finale. Saw the highlight on that. I think he'll get a lot of work there. And then Alec Ingold makes the team as a fullback, which you shouldn't be too surprised about because they gave him an extension, I believe, a year ago. The receiver room, I know a lot of people were up in arms after this. Miami only keeping 4 after the initial cut. Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle, Malik Washington, Braxton Berrios, with OBJ going to injured reserve with recall, staying on PUP, which is eligible for recall, and then cutting Eric Ezukama, who a lot of people thought should stick just kind of based on some of his preseason work. But when you're injured as much as he was, what's the old Bill Parcells expression? Hard to make the club from the tub kind of a thing. They went out and claimed Grant Dubose from the Green Bay Packers, who, for me, that transaction is basically just trying to find a stand-in for River Craycraft until River Craycraft comes back. River Craycraft, along with Cam Smith, the corner, were placed on injured reserve with recall, and you're allowed to do that with 2 players before the Week 1 regular season starts. You get 8 players total in the regular season that you can recall from IR, so they already know that they're doing those 2. Again, I know fans are up in arms about the depth and all this. If you really look at it, just look at it a year ago, the top trio that the Dolphins had for that Chargers game Week 1 was Hill, Waddle, and Braxton Berrios. You've still got those 3 guys, and you've added Malik Washington to the mix via the draft, Grant Dubose via the waiver claim. And then when you really break it down, I thought Kyle Krabs made a nice point of this after his initial 53-man podcast. Okay, look at the targets last year. Hill and Waddle were both massive up there, over 80 targets apiece. The next highest guy on the team in terms of targets was Durham Smythe. If you're looking at this in terms of total touches, you're probably going to see Hill, Waddle, Raheem Mostert, and Devon Achane, and potentially Jonnu Smith all get more touches than whoever the third receiver is, even if Odell Beckham Jr. comes back. Just kind of the nature of the beast and how this offense works, because a vast majority of the stuff you're doing in the pass game, especially to Hill and Waddle, that's most effective comes out of 12 and 21 personnel, meaning you have 2 tight ends or 2 backs, typically a running back and a fullback, respectively, with those personnel groupings. So I'm not too up in arms about this. And then they kept multiple receivers on the practice squad, which we'll touch on later in the show. The tight end room, they kept 4, and one of them was kind of the big surprise to me who made the roster. I guess one of 2 big surprises as to who made the roster. Durham Smythe, last year's starter, is back. I would imagine he'll still probably be the air quotes, starter in a lot of their base stuff that they do out of 12 and 21 personnel. Jonnu Smith on the team, Julian Hill, who had a monster training camp, who's one of the better blocking tight ends already in the league. Those 3 guys, I think, are your top tight end guys. And then Tanner Connor also made it. The note here I have is I don't know how much Tanner Connor is going to actually be lined up as a true tight end. I think he's more of an analog to Alec Ingold. You can have him do some of the H-back stuff and some of the quasi-alignment stuff that Alec Ingold does when he's not lined up as a true fullback. The other note with Tanner Connor is I had a little birdie watching a lot of the practices in camp this year. He was one of the better players on the new kickoff coverage situation. How they have the dead zone and have to wait till the opposing team catches the ball. Tanner Connor did really well with that. So I think there's some special teams value. Now, does that mean he'll be active on game days over any of the other 3? I don't know, but I think that's the reason why he's on the roster. The offensive line, they originally kept 10 guys and then ended up cutting Jack Driscoll when they re-signed Blake Ferguson after the initial roster. So kind of based on what we've known and what we've heard, because we never saw this unit play together in preseason, it sounds like the starting unit week 1, left to right, is Teron Armstead, Robert Jones, Aaron Brewer, Liam Eichenberg, and Austin Jackson. We got starts from Liam Eichenberg at right guard last year. We got starts from Robert Jones at left guard and right guard last year. Armstead and Jackson, the tackles. I think Aaron Brewer is a name that a lot of people are really going to like once you kind of get to see him play. If you want a great example of him, watch the Titans game against us last year. I know that's a nightmare fuel game, but watch how well he played against Wilkins and Sealer inside. He does give up 1 sack to Christian Wilkins in that game, but otherwise, he was probably the best center we had play against Wilkins and Sealer last year, other than Creed Humphrey from Kansas City. And that's a list that also includes Jason Kelsey in Philadelphia. So that's a pretty big compliment to Aaron Brewer. I would watch that game against us last year to kind of get a feel for how he can play and how good he is. Depth-wise, the 2 backup tackles, Kendall Lamb will be the swing guy. I think we kind of know that because in the Commanders game when Tua played, Kendall Lamb was at left tackle, not Patrick Paul. Patrick Paul, still developing him. I think you can see the potential there in the run game, but has to clean up the consistency issues with his technique and pass blocking. Then they also kept Lester Cotton as a backup guard. Lester played the 3rd most snaps out of any Dolphins offensive lineman a year ago. I think they know what they have in him. He's not the most sexy-looking offensive lineman. Doesn't move particularly well, but he's strong at the point of attack. He's been dependable in terms of being healthy and being available when they need it. Had one of the most critical blocks of the season last year. He was the key blocker on that Tyreek Hill screen pass on 3rd down in the Dallas game to get into winning or get into field goal position to win that game on that drive. Lester Cotton had the toughest block assignment and executed it well on that play to free up Tyreek. And then the surprise here, the other big surprise that made it, was Andrew Meyer, the undrafted center out of UTEP. He had some snap issues through the early part of OTAs and minicamp and then into the early part of training camp, but ends up making the team. I thought he was pretty consistent throughout the preseason from what I saw. Maybe a little small and undersized, but you've got the smallest center in the league already ahead of him in Aaron Brewer. I don't know how much flexibility there is for Andrew Meyer to come in and play some guard if you ever needed him to. So interesting to me that they sort of have 2 dedicated specific interior players. Lester Cotton as a guard, although we do know he's cross-trained as a center in the past. And then Andrew Meyer at center. So that's the Dolphins' offensive roster. In terms of the strongest unit on that team, I think you have to go probably with the running back room, just kind of given the different skill sets and how good Mostert and Achane were. I think the receiver room is pretty strong at the high end, with Hill and Waddle. I'm not necessarily concerned about it in terms of number of bodies, but I think that you have to find a way to get more out of your 3rd and 4th receiver this year, really 3 through 5, than you did last year with Braxton Berrios, Cedric Wilson, and River Craycraft. Everyone talks up River Craycraft and all this. He only caught 9 passes last year. He's had a great camp. It's unfortunate he had the shoulder injury. They'll bring him back at some point. But again, only 9 catches last year. The majority of those were in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season. I know a lot of people are going to pick on the offensive line and why didn't we go out and get a veteran, blah, blah, blah. At this point, they had a very patchwork offensive line last year and had the best offense in football. We already talked about some of the stuff they do in the passing game where there's all the run action, play action, RPO stuff baked in. So it kind of masks their pass blocking efficiency in true drop back pass sets. If you look at it honestly and objectively, this is what a lot of people hammer about. The only player on the offensive line who has a really high grade in terms of pass block efficiency is Teron Armstead. He's been an elite left tackle for years now. The problem with him has just been what it's been in Miami. It's injuries. When he's not on the field, you lose that level of play. But he's clearly the Dolphins' best offensive lineman and has been the entire tenure for Mike McDaniel when he's on the field. Otherwise, though, Austin Jackson had some nice moments last year. Kind of got in trouble towards the end of the season. There's kind of a rumor floating around that he was injured at that point or coming back from an injury that kind of prevented him from being, 100%. But the interior guys, in terms of true straight-up drop back, not great. Even Rob Hunt had a pretty bad year last year as a pass blocker. But that's why you have Tua saying the comment that he did that got taken way out of context by a bunch of people in the media. They get the ball out so fast, but they're doing it and still hitting the average depth of target that was second in the league last year, behind only Derek Carr, who's just, chucking it all over the field. But they get the ball out quick because all these actions and the speed that you have with Hill and Waddle creates vacancies on the outside and over the middle so they can get the ball out quick and get those guys in stride. So it's all kind of baked into tailoring the offense, which goes back to quarterback and why there's a difference that you see between Tua and Skylar Thompson when they have to play. But, I would recommend you listen to Travis Wingfield's Drive Time podcast from the day after when Chris Grier spoke about the roster and listen to some of the reasoning behind it. Travis is one of my oldest friends in the Dolphins community. Love the work that he's doing. Love that he came on the Sideline T podcast. I know he's going to be on with Marino here on Dolphins Talk soon, so check out those episodes and, say hi to my buddy Travis for me. Defensively, the interior line only kept 5 players: Zach Sealer, Calais Campbell, Benito Jones, Deshaun Hand, and Brandon Pilley. This, to me, the red flag is up here because I think this is probably the unit that's going to struggle the most in this defense, if not on the entire football team this year, because you lost Christian Wilkins, who played 81% of the snaps. You could play him anywhere from like a 0 out to a 5 technique, and he would give you quality reps damn near all the time. Best run defender we've had on the team, 9 sacks a year ago. It's going to be tough to replace that. Now, you have Zach Sealer, who's a damn good football player in his own right, but he's always had Christian Wilkins to play off inside alongside of him. You're losing that level, that caliber of play next to Sealer. I think in most nickel situations is probably Calais Campbell that's going to get a good chunk of the work doing that. I think he can play at that level for stretches, but not to the high degree, not to the quantity of snaps that Christian Wilkins did. I think they were kind of telling on themselves in the preseason by using a bigger defensive tackle type there as a 1 technique. So now you're kind of shifting that front structure by playing that 1 technique person a half gap tighter to the ball, which I think, you can do some stuff with it and kind of naturally eat up a double team using against the pivot, but your linebacker now has an extra half gap to cover on the strong side of the play most of the time, and you have to trust, David Long to do that. I think with the degree of run blitzes that he got called on last year and, the likely increase we'll see with that this year, you may get away with it. But I still question the quality of play you're going to get based on the number of snaps you have divided up between like Calais Campbell, Benito Jones, Deshaun Hand, who, he was great in those microdoses last year when he played 7 to 10 snaps. But now you might have to ask him to play 20 to 30 snaps, if not more. How's he going to do? Historically, he's always been a guy that's battled injuries. He got kind of pushed around by the Tampa Bay starting offensive line on that first drive, from what I've seen. It wasn't pretty. Brandon Pilley, fun story, kind of a try-hard player. Wouldn't surprise me a bit if, they get a couple weeks into the season and he's back on the practice squad and they've elevated Naquan Jones. We'll just put it like that. Edge defenders, I think you have a pretty solid group here. We'll get even more solid once you get Bradley Chubb back, but I would imagine Jaylen Phillips and Emmanuel Ogbah are the starters, You'll see a healthy rotation of Chop Robinson and Mo Kamara. Quentin Bell was kind of a surprise, like, for all the hype he got in camp. He sure didn't do much in the preseason games. He set a hard edge a couple times, but that's about it. I think he's probably one of the first guys to go once you start getting, Chubb, OBJ, Cam Smith, River Craycraft back from, the IR and the PUP list stuff. I think he's probably one of the first guys that you cut to make room for them. That's a nice rotation. I think the one liability you have there is outside of Phillips, and hopefully Emmanuel Ogbah can recapture it because he was a great edge setter in the Flores system, kind of lost his way a little bit in the Fangio system. But other than that, Chop Robinson, got his ass handed to him in the Tampa Bay game. Mo Kamara has done some nice things, and is probably better suited to be an edge setter than Chop Robinson coming out. But neither of them were great. So I think you're going to have to kind of pick and choose your situations on when to play those guys a ton, and you're going to have to roll the structure of your front to kind of cover it up for them when they're on the field in rundowns. So that's something to watch. The off-ball linebacker group, pretty strong unit. I would argue probably the strongest unit on the defense this year. David Long, Jordan Brooks, Anthony Walker, probably your top three. All have some pretty unique abilities. I think with Long and Brooks, it's their blitzing ability that's going to be utilized a ton this year, a lot more than last year under Fangio. And the blitzes will be different than from what we saw under Flores and Poyer. They're not going to be mugged up the entire time. They're going to be blitzing from linebacker depth. They're going to be blitzing from the edge. We've seen stuff where Jordan Brooks has been in the slot and has blitzed. So you'll see those things coming from a variety of places. Anthony Walker, despite kind of the player he is, has always had a pretty good coverage grade. Now, I think those things are kind of wonky just based on your assignment. Andrew Van Ginkel had a great coverage grade, but he did diddly poo in terms of a tough assignment and coverage when he was with the Dolphins. Just something to keep in mind. But having Duke Riley as your fourth and then Channing Tindall as your fifth, I think is really nice depth. It wouldn't surprise me if they gave some sort of spot duties to Tindall in a specialized package and just gave him like open close window reads and told him, okay, if the gap's open, blitz here. If it's not, blitz to the outside and just go. His athleticism is freakish. I think it's the mental side that he struggles with. But I think it's a really, really good room. Cornerback group is a little thin right now because of Cam Smith being on IR with recall. So you've got Jalen Ramsey, you've got Kendall Fuller, you've got Kader Kohou as your top three. I feel really good about Jalen Ramsey. I'm a little skeptical of Kendall Fuller. I think he could be really good in this system, but did not have a good year last year on that Washington defense. To be fair, no one did. But that's sort of a looking for a rebound year type situation. Same with Kader Kohou, who was awful most of last year. He's really good when the play happens in front of him and he can attack downhill. But man, he struggles covering down the field. So that's something you have to watch. And I think he'll have a little more help in this system than he did in Fangio's. But, got asked to do some tough things and just couldn't deliver. But you've got a lot of game experience in those three. Beyond that, Saron Neal has played at times for Buffalo. He can play in the slot. He can play outside. I think he's been used as a safety before by the Bills, but he's an excellent special teams player. He'd probably be the fourth corner to me right now. And then you have Ethan Bonner and Storm Duck. Storm Duck had a really nice preseason. I actually had him making the team in my 53. If I ever get the chance, I'll publish my prediction on Twitter or something like that. I've got it saved, and Travis Wingfield has seen it, for those that care about such things. Ethan Bonner, had a good preseason, thought he repped really well. Is he someone that you're going to want to start a game? Like, if you have to have him, do it early in the season? Probably not, but, I would love to see them get more out of Cam Smith when he's back. Safety room, they initially had Patrick McMorris there, but moved him to IR because of I believe it's an ankle injury. So you only had 4 guys on the final roster: Javon Holland, Jordan Poyer, Marcus May, Elijah Campbell. Campbell had a really nice camp. Marcus May, I thought, kind of silenced all the issues for me that I had based on his performance in the Washington game. Jordan Poyer is kind of the one where I'm still a little puzzled on how that works and how good he'll be in the system. But it's a smart veteran player, and those guys can always kind of make up for the lack of athleticism in certain scenarios. And then I think Javon Holland will be utilized a little bit differently in this system than he was last year under Fangio. I think you'll see him in more looks, and I think you'll see the team in big nickel quite a bit. So you could see him used in some of those heavy blitz packages the way Flores and Poyer did his first 2 years in Miami. Hopefully they'll get the contract extension done for him, and they can kind of move on to other Dolphins-related business. The specialist room, no surprise, Jason Sanders has been excellent. Jake Bailey they kept. I think people go up in arms about Jake Bailey because he's not a boomer. Yeah, he's had a few bad punts, but he's a really terrific holder, and I think he's pretty good at doing the directional stuff and not allowing big returns with his punts. You just like to have that net yardage be a little bit higher, but you don't want to outkick your coverage and all that. I also think he did pretty well, as did Jason Sanders, with the new kickoff where they kind of knuckle it. I believe, at least through the first 2 games, Miami had the lowest return against average in the entire league through the first 2 weeks of preseason, which was kind of an interesting thing because they were doing those kind of low knuckling line drive kicks, and Jake Bailey was pretty good at that. So kind of a hidden weapon system there for Jake Bailey. Moving on to the reserve lists. Cam Smith, River Craycraft, both on the injured reserve list with recall, which means you have to wait until after the first 3 games to bring them back, which I think is fine. You can make do without both of those guys. The PUP list still has Bradley Chubb, Odell Beckham, Cameron Good, and Isaiah Wynn. You'd feel a lot better if you had Chubb, Beckham, and Wynn ready to go, but you don't. I think Chubb is probably the closest of those guys to kind of coming back. I don't really know the whole status on Odell Beckham, but that's an injury that's kind of lingered, I think, longer than expected. And you're missing him the first 4 weeks. You're missing all those guys the first 4 weeks. But I think between Chubb, Beckham, River Craycraft, Cam Smith, you got 4 pretty talented players that you can bring back that probably lop off some of the other less talented players in the roster. If your name is Grant Dubose, Tanner Connor, Storm Duck, Ethan Bonner, maybe Channing Tindall, those guys might be in danger once they start getting some guys back, but that's a good problem to have. Practice squad wise, we already talked about Tim Boyle. I tried to look this up. I couldn't find my old draft files, but I'm pretty sure that Miami met with Deneric Prince, the newly signed running back, multiple times in that draft process. I'd have to go back and verify, but I remember that name. I'm almost certain that they did meet with him multiple times during that run-up to the draft. He was added as a running back. Receivers, they brought back Eric Ezukama, is back on the practice squad. They also brought back Robbie Chosen, who was on the team last year. So you've got 2 guys who have been in the system, know what they're supposed to do to some degree that you could rely on. And then they also brought over D. Eskridge, formerly known as Dwayne Eskridge, from the Seattle Seahawks, who's been a receiver and a return specialist in the past. So some guys that you could develop there. They also stashed Hayden Rucci, kind of the stud of the preseason tight end world, but got caught in a numbers game to develop. Offensive line, they kept Baron Matos, who's got the International Pathway Program moniker, so he does not count. So you actually get a 17th guy on the 16-man practice squad because of him. Anderson Hardy was signed out of Pittsburgh. I don't know anything about him, haven't had a chance to watch the film. Kind of a developmental tackle type. They got rid of Ryan Hayes, which, after his performance at right tackle was pretty obvious they were going to dump him. I don't think they've ever really liked the opportunities he's had inside at guard. They did try him at guard inside in this camp, but didn't go very well. Also on the roster, they brought back Chase and Hines to the practice squad. Had some nice reps. I was a little surprised they brought back him over Matthew Jones. I thought Matthew Jones, not the greatest mover, but at least had some power and some technique to kind of work from. On the defensive side of the ball, some familiar faces. They brought back Jonathan Harris, who's played in the league before with Denver. Probably a smart add to have him on that roster. Pretty easy call-up. Naquan Jones was signed from Arizona. That's a nose tackle type. He's not super huge, kind of in that T.R. Tart, or if you go back to the early Philbin days, kind of an Earl Mitchell type of mold. But wouldn't surprise me if he got moved up at some point over Brandon Pilley. Looking at linebackers, they brought back DeQuan Jackson from the preseason. Don't really get that one over Curtis Bolton, but they may see something they like, and Jackson is the younger player. In the secondary, brought back three guys. Nick Needham, who's been on the team since 2019, so he gets to stay and kind of keep coming back from that Achilles injury. Isaiah Johnson, really glad that they brought him back. Thought there might be a chance he would make it over Storm Duck, but that's just a long physical corner who's made nothing but plays. Had a couple bad beats in the preseason, but that's about it. And then Jordan Colbert, the safety from Rhode Island, big body dude who can really move, but, just coming from the Rhode Island level of play, no offense to the Fighting Darren Rizzies, but pretty big jump in terms of who he's playing against in the playbook and all that stuff. But overall, if you've got 4 or 5 guys on your PUP and IR list that you could bring back that are going to add more talent to the roster, you had a pretty talented roster going in. I think it's more talented than a year ago. I think the trouble spots for me is the interior defensive line is kind of the one that jumps out as a red flag. And then I guess offensive line, but maybe not for the reasons other fans see. I think with the O-line, you're not running a whole bunch of pin and pull plays. You're not running a bunch of power. But you're basically trusting them to have developed Liam Eichenberg and Robert Jones to a more than just a serviceable degree, which is what they've both been to this point in their Miami Dolphins tenures. They've been serviceable. I think now you want them to be good. That's going to do it for the roster preview part of the show. So again, I think offensively, strongest unit is running back, weakest unit, I guess offensive line. To me, defensively, the weakest unit is the D-line. Strongest unit is the off-ball linebackers at this point. And I think those guys will be a pretty big cog in the defense this year. Again, some housekeeping notes. I'll be on Finside the NFL, on the Finside the NFL YouTube channel Wednesday night. I believe that starts at either 7 or 8 Eastern time. I'll have to tweet out a confirmation. And then Evan and I will be recording an episode previewing our Week 1 matchup against the Jaguars on Thursday night. Should be available Friday or Saturday as we get into Week 1 weekend. Everybody, thank you guys for listening to the show. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, wherever else you listen. Thank you guys, and go Fins. And this episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you, too. International fans as well. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com.